This is Power 102 Digital Monday. Yes, it is Power 102 Digital Monday. And on Mondays, we start off with Hard Talk. Hard Talk starts now with hosts Karen Nunez, Tesheira, and Dennise Demming. We have a very special guest. I'll allow the ladies to introduce the guest when she comes on. Good afternoon, ladies.
Good afternoon to you, David, and of course, all those in the back who we don't see but are now really part of bringing on Power to 102 FM, and you as the program director. I'm speaking for myself, and of course to Dennise and say, but I do appreciate the audience, even when they have critical things to say. It's good. It helps us to grow. It helps us to grow, and we appreciate your comments, and we hope to continue along that way as we have done in the past. And I let Dennise give her a little introduction while we wait on the guest. Yes.
Yes, good afternoon, and I'm very happy to be here because every time I do this program with you, Karen, there's something that I learn, and that is such a tremendous thing to learn because that helps in terms of the long run. Today, we should be talking about crime, and Rhoda Redock is our guest. David, do you have any comments? Do you have any responses from Rhoda?
Not as yet. Not as yet. I spoke to her a while ago and I told her I sent her the link and we start promptly at 4:15. So I'm going to give her a call while the guys chat.
And perhaps Dennise, because you're better remembering the numbers than I am, and given the thing that people should join in because we love to have them. If you do that, yeah.
Yes. I'm better. You think I'm better at you, but look at
Well, you are. It's some things for sure. For sure.
All right, but we look forward to people joining us and to calling and to letting us know what your views are as well, because the ultimate interest is the development of our country. So that we expect people, we invite you to call. As long as you call, if not call, write, put a note, and we will read your note to ensure that that your comments, your views, your opinions are stated. And I can't find the numbers, Karen.
Let me give you those numbers. Those numbers are 222-8255, 222-8255, and our toll-free number 866-525-1099. Toll-free 866-525-1099. So 222-8255 and 866-525-1099. You could also send your comments via Facebook or YouTube, and I'll have them read off the studio's list in here.
Okay.
Could you put the numbers like how you did? You had streamed it at one time, and at one time the numbers were streaming, not for very long, but they were. Right, there we go. I actually know the dark jargon. I use the word streaming. So be proud of me for that.
Very true.
I don't think we've always started, so I would wait for Rhoda Redock to join us. And I know you say that we shouldn't really go into all the, because we can't with her, it's so long, but at least I could pinpoint some of her accomplishments, at least for the audience to know that, right?
Of course.
We can't not do this show without mentioning that Biden has dropped out of the race. And it seems as though Kamala Harris, part Jamaican, part Southeast Asian, India, is the apparent nominee, because the 13th of August is when they have their national convention and formally nominate their candidate for the presidency. This is an unusual situation. And the only reason I'm mentioning it is because it seems more and more that, if I know you can't go by polls and so on, but how things have, I don't even want to use the word evolve, because evolve has a thing of calmness and order, how things have just imploded within the last few weeks. That it seems more and more likely that Mr. Trump will be returning to the presidency. And of course, we know what that can mean for many of our countries, including Trinidad and Tobago and a lot of other, because I don't know if you have any view on that, or we have Professor Redock with us. Redock. Sorry, I'm saying Redock. It's Redock. And my apologies.
Yes.
I don't know where Dennise is right now, but Dennise, Professor Redock, you're hearing me? You have your mic.
Your mic is muted.
Yes, I'm hearing you.
Good, great.
Well, Dennise is the inspiration for asking, saying, let us have Rhoda Redock on. And of course, Karen Tesheira said 100%. I mean, no, so Dennise, I don't know when if she comes back on, she can talk more on it because she really was our inspiration for this. And usually she says, well, I do understand that sometimes we have guests that have such long, and I mean it in a positive way. If you would try to read out their accomplishments, the show wouldn't, and in your case, it would take up the show. But at least I have to say that you were deputy principal of UWI St. Augustine. You are professor emeritus. And I realized one thing which I did not know before, because I always identified you with gender issues only. Really, I have to say. But when I went on Wikipedia and I read other sources, including university sources, I realized your breadth of knowledge and interest span a very wide areas of, not only, and that's why today, because of Dennise, which I'm looking for all the time, I don't know where she is, but that is why you have you as educator, researcher, feminist, and social activist. I think that would cover a lot of what you do, and you are a well-known name and highly most important, I think, for the listeners and for us, highly respected and highly regarded. So while I wait for Dennise to reappear, we know that. Yes, I'm good to know. I know you're more than capable of choosing it off from now. The issue, of course, is crime, and I think you had given us a kind of indication of where your focus would have been, because you presented a paper in January 2024, and you gave us the benefit of your slides. But Dennise is back, so she will continue unraveling the context of criminal violence in Trinidad and Tobago. So I let Dennise take over.
Gosh, Karen.
No, you well familiar, and you all have spoken about it. When I have that, I will certainly do the same thing.
Rhoda, it's so good to see you. And what inspired me to invite you to this is I attended a criminal summit in January, and you did an excellent presentation on unraveling the context of criminal violence in Trinidad and Tobago. Could you just share with us what is the background? What were you saying there? What was the background to that?
Thank you very much, and thank you to my two hosts, Karen and Dennise, for inviting me. Actually, as Karen mentioned, my area of work is quite extensive and diverse, and I've been monitoring for many years the situation with young people in particular and with our societies in general. And I've been trying to document the factors that have contributed to this. So I've actually written quite a number of papers and presentations on this with different facets. And the presentation I gave at that NGO Crime Talks was actually bringing together, because I was only supposed to have 15 minutes. I think I went over the time. I was really trying to
So familiar to me.
a lot of the thoughts and ideas and information that I had into that short space of time. So I also want to mention that I did write an article, send in an article to like an op-ed piece, which was published in the Express a few years ago. It was entitled "It's the Social Sector Stupid," which was a take on that other statement that is well known. It's the economy stupid. Can't remember who said it. But I think that basically what I was trying to say then is that whatever we were doing will not get us out of this situation, and that we needed to think differently and to reintegrate the social into our analysis, because that had been kind of let out for over the last 30 to 40 years.
Could I ask you what you mean exactly? You'll have to excuse me if my point of view is very much impacted or infected, whichever word you prefer to use, by my political experience and so on. But two things I really would want clarity, because I did read your what do you call it, your PowerPoint presentation, which is very detailed. So what do you mean that the social situation in country has impacted on the crime, and what do you see as the major cause of crime? Because I couldn't, with all due respect, I take from the people, at least from what I read. I know you identified a lot of the economic challenges and social interventions in your presentation and the challenges that you have, especially with the youth. But I did not see, or maybe I wasn't, what you was identifying, not as a symptom of a crime, and what is the major crime in this country, and what is not a symptom of what is the cause. Because unless you get to the cause, all those things, poverty only exacerbates an already bad situation. Poverty only makes it easier for the crime to flourish. But unless you deal with the source of it, all of those things are really not going to are going to have the same result as you have said in your paper. The 60s and 70s doing the same thing over and over again, and it's not working. So, what do you see as the cause of the crime, and what is the cause of the crime, and what is your prescription for really getting to the cause, not just the symptoms of the crime?
Right. Now, the first thing I want to say is that there's always been crime in Trinidad and Tobago. In many of the smaller territories, let's say murder was almost non-existent a few decades ago. But Trinidad always had a little crime. But what we are seeing now is an exponential increase. And the first point I was trying to make in my paper is that Trinidad and Tobago is not the only country in that situation. In fact, in the presentation, I gave figures for St. Lucia, Jamaica, St. Vincent, which actually probably has a higher rate, at least in the data I had then, Bahamas, Haiti, etc. And if I were to go further, many parts of Central America and countries like Brazil experiencing the same situations. So, whereas we have to look at our internal situations, what our governments have done or not done, what they understand and what they don't understand, issues of corruption or poor expenditure, etc. I think when you see a global pattern, it's necessary to see what is similar and what has changed. And the main thing that has changed was that around the late 1970s, there was a shift in the global economic system. Now, I deal with economic issues as well as the social, but they actually are related. And that shift in the economic system was one that basically shifted the focus from people to profits. And actually, Karen, in some of your talks, I've heard you speak about various kinds of investments that take place here. And many of them are not. Anyway, I'll get back to that. Let's not go down that road, at least not yet. Yes. So, what happened, for example, if we take Trinidad and Tobago as a case? I think it was 1986 that we went to the IMF. Probably forgot. And at that time, the IMF and the World Bank, that we had gone through the boom, we had spent all the money, we blah, 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 got into debt and ended up at the doors of the IMF. And basically, there were some key things that we had to do. We had to cut back in public spending, and that is one of the critical prescriptions that's given everywhere. That cutback in public spending also means that certain sectors of government have to be shifted, either done away with totally or shifted to the so called private sector or NGOs. And this was one of the first things that happened, but somehow it happened in such a way that we didn't even notice it was happening. So, for example, a lot of the social services that were available before that time, I don't know if you remember, we used to have addiction and substance abuse prevention work. There was an organization, there's a sector called NADAP. I was asking the other day what it does. I think all it does is give grants to people who have to go for treatment somewhere. But NADAP used to do public education. They used to go into schools. They used to have ads. They used to sensitize the population on the challenges of substance abuse. And actually, there were actually a lot of centers, rehab centers. We had quite a few rehab centers in the country, which were partially funded through the Ministry of Social Development. I think now we have one rehab center at Mount St. Benedict, which I think might be subsidized by the government, but that's a huge shift from what we had at the time. So what happened is that a lot of the community-based social work, that disappeared. So if you notice, many times we hear about families in rural communities or urban communities have no food, children didn't go to school, children have no birth certificates, so they can't go to school, they have no food, and therefore, in other words, the system is not structured to keep track of the poor of children in all these circumstances. So these children go through life, and the next thing we hear about them, they're either in a gang or we've shot them dead. In other words, we've paid no attention to these children in these communities, these marginalized communities, which have increased since that time for factors which we could discuss again later. I could answer that question. But you have marginalized communities. This last week, I went to Prince Street, which was near where I went to school. I went to school, Eastern Girls on George Street, one of the best schools in the country. Next to that was Eastern Boys. Well, I was so shocked to see the marginalized condition of these areas, which have basically been left to fall on their own swords. The so-called plannings that was up at that school. I had many friends who lived there and who came to the school, proper middle class, lower middle class people. I remember where I ate lunch on Nelson Street. One of the government ministers at the time, his sister lived in the plannings. But these communities have now been left to deteriorate for a number of reasons. First of all, the shift in the economic system that happened in that time. A lot of indigenous production, both in terms of manufacturing and agriculture, that infrastructure declined because the world faced a situation of free trade and we had to compete, and it was decided that we couldn't compete, and therefore whole sectors of the economy ceased to function and large numbers of people without work or any opportunities for employment. Now, the other component of this shift, because so many people are now without any jobs, the shift now is for entrepreneurship. So, in other words, people now are responsible for themselves. Now, that is fine. Every society has entrepreneurs. My entire family on my father's side were business people, entrepreneurs. That's a reality. However, not everybody has to be like that, because then who is going to buy from these entrepreneurs? So you had a situation where the economic system that would have supported large numbers of working class persons in a dignified way, that was removed, and the systems that would have helped them, the psychosocial, the whatever systems that would have helped them even continue in education, that was stopped. Another big thing that happened is that so social development then became grants. That's what it became. I remember I had a former student who came to see me at UWI. She said, Professor Redock, I studied social work and all I do is write checks, because the work of going into the communities, of following up with cases, that has gone. The district health visitor who would know what was happening, the district health visitor doesn't go to the district anymore. The district health visitor works in an office. So if you have people with babies that never go to prenatal care, Nobody knows until the child turns up in the hospital and something goes wrong. Children who are malnourished, nobody knows. There's no system and structure to look after people. People are basically left on their own and then blamed when they cannot function. Anyway,
Rhoda,
I
Rhoda,
yes, I
just
I'll
realize,
let Dennise intervene, and I will then give you a
comment that I
completely different take on what you've just said.
Yeah.
right.
What
Yeah.
you've just said is absolutely valid. And my memory, I grew up in Quarry Street. I attended Nelson Street Girls RC School, and I had friends in the plannings.
Mm-hmm.
I tell people one of my early exposures to a proper toilet was in the plannings.
Mm-hmm.
Because in those days, they lived on, I think, the second floor, and it
Mm-hmm.
was absolutely wonderful. It was absolutely safe. There's
Mm-hmm.
something else I remember as a child, and that is that there used to be, I don't know if it's nurses or social workers coming to your home. They used to
Yes.
wear a brown
Yeah, district
uniform.
health visitors.
They used to come, and I remember one of them harassing my mother and saying that you have to send her to school every day. Now, what I don't understand is when did that stop? And what was the thinking behind stopping that? Are you familiar
Yeah,
with that?
but that's what I was trying to explain, that was the IMF and World Bank policy. And when Trinidad and Tobago went to the for debt, these were some of the conditionalities, but they're never announced. They are just quietly implemented. And the thing is that even though we are not under an IMF program, most member countries are under what you call IMF surveillance. So the IMF still guides our economic policies and even our budgetary allocations. So what happened with that is that according to that policy, the state should not be dealing with the people and the poor. That is the role of NGOs. I remember a Trinidadian World Bank staffer came to my women's group, Working Women. She said, "Don't you agree that NGOs are closer to the poor and that you're in a better state to help them?" And I said, "No." But basically that was the argument they were putting. So that NGOs in the past used to be about public education, used to be about advocacy. Now many of the NGOs have had to take over responsibilities that the state had. Now I just want to point out that's similar to what happened in Britain and over the last 14 years. And if you notice, the new British Prime Minister, one of his first actions is to deal with the prisons, because the prisons are the repository of our failures. And what we do there is just reproduce the criminal situation. So every time people speak about putting people in prisons, to do what? You know, and therefore, until those systems are addressed, we are just going to get worse, because you're just having this more and more people caught in this web of nowhere to go.
Okay,
And
can
this is
I,
where
can I
the
interject?
problem comes up
Can I
that-
interject now?
Yes.
Because I've listened to your take on the crime. All I will tell you, you dealt with the symptoms. You have not dealt with the cause of the crime. Because in fact, there are articles, too many articles in the papers that you can't help but notice. Government's complicity with crime, and they talked about the drug trade. There have been so many articles written about Trinidad being a porous borders, and that we are a major drug shipment point. There's been so many articles written, and even when you use St. Vincent, they're doing it per 100,000. If St. Vincent has 200,000 people, they have a lot. They've had 3 or 4 murders. So if you're using it by the per 100,000, St. Vincent came up very high. The reality is that Trinidad and Tobago has a far higher murder rate if you didn't use that per 100,000 marking. We did come up number 6 though. But coming back to the point, the articles in the paper say the drug trade fueling the crime. Every person acknowledges at the core of our problems is crime. And in fact, one of the articles says, "Are we seeing a repeat of the 1980s?" Because I'm glad you talked about all the things that we had done. because I read about the economy of Trinidad and Tobago, and there was a time in the 1970s that unemployment was 17%. Right? So we went through some very difficult times. We had DUD, we had single parents, we had much less education than they have now. They didn't have a UTT, they didn't have a post-start, they didn't have the expansion of the UE program. They cannot question that primary, post-secondary education opportunities are far more than they were in the 70s and the 80s, and yet we have an explosion of crime starting in the 80s. And what started it? According to the newspaper article, this is in the one of the national newspapers, it says in 1986 and 1987, indicated that equipment in the armed forces was deteriorating and poorly maintained. Very few of the 150 vehicles of the defense force were believed operational in early 1987. In late 1986, 4 Coast Guard vessels were deemed inoperable, and 3/5 of the customs and excise launchers were reported down, with repairs delayed and indefinite because of a lack of funds. With the course of time, a report of large-scale arms smuggling from Grenada into Trinidad and Tobago, from Grenada, Barbados, Venezuela, Colombia, a group of highly sophisticated special operation weapons and the Soviet AK-49 and the UZ-21 sniper guns were being stored in Trinidad, and they had the murder rate exploded. And then you related to the economy. That was the same time when that was happening, when the economy collapsed. In 1980, drug trafficking fueled serious national security problems in 1987. And in 1984, the Chamber's government appointed a commission to examine the drug problem called the Scott Report. It was not released except by the NER in 1987. And they identified that the explosion of the use of cocaine and the trade route based in Trinidad and Tobago's location was a market fit for not only drugs, but unlicensed guns. At that same time, this is why they said, are we experiencing the 1980s again? Because what they said, when I read about the economy of Trinidad and Tobago in the 50s and 40s, even our culture was not doing badly. He said, are we seeing a repeat of the 1950s, 1980s? They're saying a decade of 1980s, they talk about how well the economy was doing. We know the economy is in the tank, right? I won't go into that. But guess what is happening right now? Because the Minister of Finance had to go on an affidavit for the implementation of TTRA and said we cannot borrow anymore. He took out 160 million US and put it in the consolidated fund and did not report it to the country. He has borrowed and borrowed to pay current expenditure. We have debt right up to the wazoo. We have no foreign exchange. Our foreign exchange is there, which is bolstered by the HSF, and it's paying bonds. Those bonds have to be repaid in US. Our foreign exchange is in a dire situation. Our debt is through the roof. And even when they talk about employment, so the economy, so let's see what's happening now. What happened in the 1980s when the economy collapsed, because we were doing very well after 1973. And then all the units of the government that are to protect, because we acknowledge and recognize it was the drug trade that was fueling what was happening in the country. The murders that you read about are unlicensed guns entering in the country. That's what you're reading about. All these gangs you're reading about is coming from drug trade, not all those other things. Those things were always there. I was not a student of science, but as a student, if I was to do an experiment and I was to leave everything the same in Mouvant and Laventil in the 1960s, I might hear about a foul thing, a domestic murder, but you would not be hearing about unlicensed guns entering in the country. And the police have said there has been an explosion of gangs. And what is their business? Drugs, extortion. That is what is the problem. And this is what and I didn't make this up. Are we seeing a repeat of the 1980s? Look at what is said. This is in the Joint Select Committee meeting. First of all, 5 scanners. 4 of the 5 scanners are not working. So all the guns and drugs that are going to be entered in this country, and how we found that out, because the poor deputy acting commissioner, she's the controller of customs, said only one is working, is the American oil. For months, in and out this country, and you want to know where the guns and drugs coming from. Number one. Number 2, the DPP has been campaigning for years and years and years for staffing. He's down, he should have 134 staff. He's down to 57. And they just had a Privy Council decision saying that the civil courts have no right to interfere with the criminal jurisdiction of the DPP because there's enough protection there. So the DPP is being almost deprived of, and he is the one to persecute crimes. Number two. Number three, the Forensic Center has a backlog for DNA sampling, hundreds of thousands of, not hundreds, over about 32,000 in DNA sampling and sampling for guns. Number five, I spoke to the head of the head of the Chief of Defense Force. He said 50% of the Defense Force vessels are down. He said 460 Nigerian vessels need upkeep. 2 utility crafts and 1 fast patrol are out of service. The air carriers has been almost closed down. So demand, but that is a thing. So is there a connection between the 1980s? So what I'm trying to say, all what you're saying is just we are not Brazil. In fact, when you talk about St. Kitts and Nevis got in trouble with drugs. So St. Lucia has the same problem because they're saying they're taking the operations of these gangs are becoming 6s and 7s and all kind of Evans, and now they're moving their operations into Tobago, all of the islands. So why are we talking all those things when if I went to you and I had a fever and you're going to tell me to take a Panadol because I have a fever, but you're not going to deal with the cause of it, you will never, never, ever solve the problem in this country until you are willing to acknowledge that the core of the problem in this country is the drug trade that is fueling over $50 billion according to the Americans in trade. And until you're willing to get to the core reason, you will never get me well. I will never get well. And you can tell me 101. Those things that you bring up are casualties of the problem. If you are living in a poor society, a poor community, as many of these people lived since the 50s and 60s with Jude, many of them didn't live in, they lived with Jude, single parent mothers with 3 and 4 children, poverty, in 1970, 17% unemployment, right? Why don't you have guns, unlicensed guns, and drugs? Why don't you talk about the cause of the crime and then we could try to fix it? I'm sorry, Ms. Dr. Redock, but it really upsets me when I hear that kind of conversation.
Dr. Redock, I think you're muted.
It really doesn't upset me.
Unmute.
A lot for that. As you said, I have written on many things, including the narco trafficking.
Yes.
And in fact, the point I am making is that the social context within which we are operating provides a fertile ground for narco trafficking. So, for example, Barbados, during when Trinidad went to the IMF in the 1980s, Barbados refused. And they decided, the government met with their unions, and they decided to do their own internal adjustments. As a result, their social sector was not destroyed in the way ours was. Their child board still functions. A lot of their structure still functions. And in fact, now that Barbados finally went to the IMF, had to fire 3,000 members of public sector and other changes, of course, they are more open to the impact of narco trafficking, which we are seeing. And what you're saying is absolutely true. That's the point I was making, that a whole section of the world, not only here, because of the shift in the globe. In fact, in the United States, part of the rise of Trump has been the deindustrialization of many parts of the South where the majority of whites work, when all the jobs were shifted to China. And then you had this mass of people who are accustomed to a decent standard of living, all of a sudden left out without anything. And therefore, they are the ones who are open to right-wing leaders, to criminal people. In other words, you create the conditions that make it easier for this to happen. And this has been happening in numerous parts of the world.
I'm talking about Trinidad. I'm interested in Trinidad. I am interested in
Right, but that's the problem I find in Trinidad, that people see. Okay.
identify that because we are a good transshipment point, that they pass the drugs through here. When I was in government, they had the minister speak in detail on it. So it's not that other countries don't have challenges. I'm saying we know it's the porous borders, and we know they're letting them in, and yet, and we know, just like in the 80s, they allowed everything to fall apart. So all those other things are only going to make poor children without any kind of structure. I mean, we have more education now and more.
No, we don't.
No, they
Let
don't.
me just, I wanted to deal with a lot of the points
Oh,
that you
tell me
raised.
that. Tell me
Yes,
that.
on the question of education,
Yes,
I
ma'am.
think that more, how do you measure more education? One way,
Well,
and I think, wait, let me finish. I think
mm,
that what the aim of free education for everyone at all levels is
mm,
something I absolutely support,
support.
and it's
Mhm.
something that I'm very proud of Trinidad and Tobago. But the quality of that education, in my view, you have more people getting schooling, you have more people getting papers or subjects, but not education. And I've been teaching for the last 33 years. I could tell you, even though many people didn't go to secondary school, there were other outlets. There was continuing education that existed in all the communities. There was still the school leaving certificates. There were the trade schools, and there were alternatives. And when you say the unemployment rate was 17% in the 80s, that is one of my biggest beefs. How is unemployment measured?
Mm.
Unemployment is measured by the people who have asked for work in the last 3 months. And the situation is, you have a situation of chronically unemployed people who not bothering to ask for work. And that is why this 4% unemployment is a joke. It
I
has
agree with you.
always been a joke. So when you compare the 80s to now, you have to really understand, what are you comparing? And the other point I wanted to make, which I made in the presentation, was that even though you didn't have such extremes of wealth as you see now, in the period of the 1940s, that's when the British changed their colonial policy. And I pointed out in my presentation that prior to that, the colonial officials had no social system, nothing for the population. People
No.
lived in abject poverty, barrackyards, blah, blah, blah. After the pandemic, the first pandemic, the Spanish flu, after 2 world wars, when Europe was destroyed, the global system decided World War III should never, oh, I forgot, the rise of fascism. They decided this should never happen again. They formed the UN. Also, in that time, there was a shift again. That was a shift in global thinking. And they began to realize that you can't just look after wealth creation. We have to look at the interests of the people. And that's when you had social democratic governments in, for example, the Scandinavian countries and many parts of Europe, and the Labour Party in Britain. And that is how we got the plannings. We got the plannings because there was a new colonial policy after 1945 that began to look after the Moyne Commission report that said you cannot allow these colonies to continue to be in those conditions. That's when we had public housing for the first time, expanded public health care for the first time. That's when social work was introduced. My mother was a social welfare advisor. She used to work in County Caroni, and she said, "We have a motor scooter to go to communities
Oh,
to
gosh.
locate people to see who needed help and who needed support." That is when we first had people from Trinidad. They got scholarships to go to Britain to study social statistics. Jack Harewood, they study sociology, social welfare. That was the time when
Dr. Redock,
let me
Dr.
just finish. No, just now, let me finish.
All right, so because
Where the
I'm really
social
having problems with
structure
what you're saying.
was established. So that,
Problems.
okay, sorry. Sorry.
No,
Okay,
no, 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 go ahead. No, no, no. I mean, you're
what I
making
was
a good
saying,
point.
so what I was saying
Point.
is that
Point is so
even though
global rather than
I was saying that even
concentration on
though
us.
in the 80s,
Okay.
60s, and 80s, you had growing unemployment, yes, but you did not have the kind of social degradation and impoverishment, even in the inner city areas where we went to school, as you have today. And
Why do you think
therefore,
that is so? Why do you think that is so?
because of the shift in policy, the
No,
shift in
and why is
people.
it shift in policy? Don't you see? I just read to you that many people, I don't want to call names of persons or academics who have written on the papers, is it by error, mistake, that these things are happening, that these persons are being a non-living wage. And what I want to say, you talk about the planning many times. My husband was from the planning. He grew up in Nelson Street. And guess what? He had to move his father out of Nelson Street. You know why? Because the drugs took over Nelson Street. I know for myself because I used to go there and you would see, well, I never was exposed to any coke, anything, but I done seen pipes. I don't even know what these pipes are. I don't know anything. You could not go in Nelson Street and it turned out into gangs and drugs. What is dominating out? I don't care what happening in Sweden or in Brazil. I care what happening in my country. And the reality is that he had to move out his family out of Nelson Street, his father out of Nelson Street, where his father grew up. You are right. A lot of people who you spoke about came from Nelson Street, or those what you call behind the bridge. A lot of our top people, our Chief Justice came from there. There are many people who we look up to in our society came from there. His father was in the prisons, was a prison officer, right? But when my husband passed away, his brother and all, and they had to leave there because the drug lords took over and became drug dens and became controlled by gangs, and that is the fact.
Okay, may I say something? I agree with you completely that narco trafficking is responsible for most of the crime and violence that's happening
Thank you very much.
in Central America, in South America, in the Caribbean, etc.
Thank you.
I agree with you completely. And I've even written on the guns, on the different companies and the gun companies and the whole relationships and the link between the US, which is the main producer of guns, and all our countries here. So it's not something that I'm not aware of. But I'm also raising another point. How do we prevent that as a small country? Now, I agree with you. I've always criticized the customs. I've always criticized those problems. But like, for example, I'm on the CEDAW committee.
Yes.
And our last meeting, Brazil came. And the Brazilian civil society groups, NGOs, were so well prepared. It was a pleasure.
Yeah.
But the problems they were talking about sounded so familiar.
Yeah.
And I wrote my questions related to those problems.
Yeah.
And those young activists came to me after. They said, how did you know? You expressed exactly what we are going through.
Right.
And they wanted to take pictures with me, which they probably posted on Facebook or wherever. But you know what? But let me tell you what I was seeing happen in Brazil. In the border areas with French Guiana, where the indigenous people live, French Guiana, I think it's Colombia, whatever, the narco trafficking, the drugs coming in, the indigenous people getting drug addicted, the guns, the murder, the shoot, blah, blah, blah. That was it. Then you heard in the cities, especially in the Afro-descendant region, similarly, overrun with guns, but the response to it is what we call in the field securitization.
But you don't understand, Dr. Redock. I think what we're trying to tell you, by the way, I just want to use a quotation. So it will be no question that we are in the hands of a transnational organized crime. When Dennise Hall was murdered, she was a good friend of mine for many years. And this Mr. Smithfield, who was he was the deputy director of the DEA dealing with drugs and enforcement within the region. And Dana was what you call when you get that man who was the foreign advisor to JFK, and he has a scholarship named in his name. Anyway, she got one.
Hubert Humphrey.
Not Hubert Humphrey, but it's a well-known scholarship, right? Anyway, she got one, and she had gone to see him. I think he had come to Trinidad, and she had gone to see him. About 2-3 days after he left, she was murdered. He has gone on record. At least 2 or 3 times and said that was not a case of anyone trying to steal. They say book bag. Americans will say hoops, right? I was stealing a book bag. That was a transnational organized crime operation operating in Trinidad and Tobago. And he said that when Dana was murdered 10 years ago. How are we not knowing that all? Do you not think, is it not possible for you to think that perhaps things are not working? The vessels not working, the aircraft closed down. These things are just like in the 1980s, is a mirror image. I didn't say that. Has it not occurred to you that perhaps this is happening precisely to keep people in a situation of need where they are not making enough a living wage? And when these people come to recruit in these vulnerable communities, they are easily recruitable as opposed to going in middle class homes with the two parents and it's harder to penetrate. Don't you think that there is some sort of complicity here?
Can I just intervene here a little?
Yes, Dennise, sure, of course.
Rhoda, Karen, can we please allow Rhoda to give her point of view?
Yeah, finish. I made my point.
Karen, what I'm hearing is a continuous, almost, I don't know. But what you're doing is preventing Rhoda from making her point. For example, Rhoda has talked about education. And she talked about education as free education. And I would like to suggest to her that I do not think we have free education in this country.
But I never disagreed with her.
Well, wait now. Can I make the point?
Dennise, I would suggest that you let Rhoda talk. And I am not an interviewer as you are. I am a spokesperson, and
Rhoda,
I will give my point of view, and I will let Rhoda speak. As I let her speak before, and I let her speak for a long time, and neither you nor I interrupted her. So I'll do it again, just how I've done in the past, and you will pay me the same dignity and same respect. I think it should be done. I think it should be done with that. It doesn't reflect well.
No, but I would really like to get to the question of education, because that is the highest budgetary item and you could correct me as a former Minister of Finance. That's the highest budgetary item in nearly all our budgets. I think some years national security may get a little more, but education. And I agree with you, education is not free. But but it's freer than in many countries. Like in South Africa, where students still have to pay school fees.
So in Jamaica,
apartheid has ended. So I think that, I try to put things in perspective. My concern, though, is that I believe teachers should be getting more pay. I don't understand why a banker should get more pay than a teacher. That is my personal view. And the reality is that the way the society has gone is that professions are not valued as good in and of themselves. The only value we put on things is when you make millions of dollars.
That is true.
Many parents actually discourage their children from becoming teachers, but yet they want good teachers for their children. And also, my mother long ago, the brilliant, the brightest, and the best were teachers. Nowadays, people believe that if you're a teacher, you lack in ambition. So I think that there's a whole value system that has accompanied the shift that has been very destructive to the society. So that what we have are people who go to school but get very little education. And I think that is what you find. Now, there are some people from middle class, and Karen, I don't use this single parent, double parent, distinction that you make. But there are people whose parents will harass them, cook food for them, drive them to lessons, including on Sunday, which is not the way children are supposed to be brought up.
That is true.
So that they get through the system. But that is not education. That
That
is
is
not
true.
learning. We have a society where we don't teach our own history. Many schools don't talk literature. A large proportion of students, their O levels are English, maths, if you're lucky, POB, POA, and whatever. And no history, no geography.
That is
Maybe they
true.
might do a science, integrated science, and then that is considered completed secondary education. And we also have a system where from 9 years old, we are abusing children to sit an exam
Exactly.
on three subjects: verbal ability, numerical ability, and I can't remember what is the third.
Writing,
Right.
creative writing or
So
reports.
2 years at least of a child's life is focused on this. You have
Mhm,
11-year-olds saying they're stressed. That is
mhm.
so no wonder half of the population don't, they never succeed in our system. And the teachers focus on those who they think will succeed
That
and
is
forget the
true.
rest. And I do not agree with something that people say often, which is that some people who are not academically inclined, somehow it's always the poor people who are
Yeah,
not academically inclined.
I agree
But
with
I
you.
feel that unless you, even if you have a learning disability, and
Yeah.
some people who are physically disabled, there's a certain level of basic knowledge and understanding of the world that every child under good circumstances can acquire. And therefore we are not preparing children for life, we are preparing them to pass exams in 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 more and more specialized areas. So
But
yes, fewer people had went to secondary school.
secondary school
But
or
I
to
can tell you, in
Christian.
the 1930s in Trinidad, we had literary and debating societies throughout the country. At least 100. There were 34 Indian ones, and over must be over 80 or 90 ones in among the rest of the community. People who read, who recited poetry, who debated, and these were grassroots, what I call proletarian intellectuals. Now most of the students who come out of our high school system, they don't have that. They're not articulate. They don't have that because our system has robbed them of a real education. And I think the continued deterioration we're going to see in our society is when we don't right those very basic wrongs. Did the woman, what's her name?
You're
Who
not
was
stopping her from talking, right?
no, just one last point. What's her name? Debbie Jacob. And most people will tell you, the people at Alta, that the majority of people in prison, the men in prison, cannot read or read very little. So that points me. So they are in a way outside of a system that is based on writing and reading, right? So what I'm saying is that there's a basic structural problems. Yes, there's the narco trafficking, but if we don't deal with those problems, then the whole society is really going to disintegrate.
Well, can I tell you that?
Yes, sorry.
Is it all right for me to talk, Denise? Okay, because what I wanted to say is that one of the things you will agree with is, because I know it from my own family, I've seen it so many times with other people, that our children somehow get into the best universities and best colleges in the United States, even though they have attended junior sex, where in our system, because we have the British system, which is an elitist, exclusive system, and whereas the American system is more inclusive, you find these very same children who are doing so badly in our system being at the top of, about Caribbean children in United States. They excel in their system, whether it is at the undergraduate, graduate, or at high school level, because whether something is wrong with our system or not, something is even more wrong with the American system. So, with all due respect, I think we should understand that we do produce a certain quality of students in this country, that in a first world country we excel, even though they do not in our own system. I think you need to acknowledge that. And I do agree with you about the education being so narrow, right? I do agree with you about the education so narrow, and it really is, I think, up to the. I agree with you that they need to look at the whole educational curriculum. I agree with you 100% with what you said about how narrow and what is education, but it's a fact that our children really do well. And, when you send them abroad, they're doing so bad in our schools and they just excel in their schools.
I'd like to respond to you because I think there are two things there.
Right.
Yes, that is true. Because of the way the US system is also, there's a lot more opportunity, for example, to catch up where you didn't catch up, and the system, as you say, but not always. A lot of our people who migrate, we know about the ones who succeed, but there's a whole group who do not. If you go to Brooklyn, you'll see all of them, some of them there. So, but let me just finish one point. I remember once I was speaking to a colleague from a US university, and she told me that US universities like Caribbean and Trinidadian students to apply. And I said, why? She said, your students are very good at taking exams, at passing exams. And when they come with those high SAT scores, we get all the federal funding increased. And that's why they come all down here to recruit.
Exactly.
So this is what I'm saying. So there are many factors within this situation. And I really feel that we need to have in-depth conversations, because these 2 hours here, you're just scratching the surface. And there's so many issues that I feel are contributing, and the education system is one of them. For example,
I agree with you. All I just say is that I think what you're saying is this narrow way that we interpret education is what allows our children to excel in their system. And they do come down, because when my son was in school, one of the things they said why St. Mary's suffered a lot was because they would come down and take the children in lower 6, right? And come and take them to their top schools to increase their GPA so they get more federal funding. My daughter was one that they came looking and they came all to the Caribbean because our system is very exclusive, and it is not right. It's not. I agree with you. I agree with you about that. We are not on the wrong. We are not on a different page about the fact that we have this narrow learn it off, rota thing without even thinking, and we excel at taking exams. I agree with you, but how do you fix that too? How do you fix it?
I think the first thing is you have to rethink the meaning of education and what it's about. So that, and it's very hard because we are, for example, at UWI, to get into law, medicine, or any of the highly competitive faculties, in Trinidad, you need much higher qualifications than if you're in Barbados or Jamaica. And the doctors, lawyers are what we produce are no better. So what I'm saying is that we are competing so much that we are competing ourselves to death. We are destroying the very thing that we were doing. So I think we really have to look at that. And we are destroying the people in the process. Before I left, I did a study on depression and mental health among university students. And we found, for example, well, I don't want to stigmatize faculties, but like students who ended up in other faculties who had not got into medicine or law or whatever, many of them suffered depression, many committed suicide or had suicide ideation. This country is not just the poor who have a problem. All of us have problems. There was a study done by a colleague from the US who came and was, of my host, I was hosting. She did a study of all-in-one preschool on the BTM. That's preschool. And, I lent that study to someone who never brought it back.
You look like you're looking for them.
Every so often I can't believe that, because it was I keep searching on the net. I can't even remember her name. But that study struck me so much. She pointed out how already in the preschool, how much cognitive problems these little children were facing. Children whose fathers were shot to death in front of their eyesight. Children who had experienced trauma. children who were malnourished, and these are preschool children. And
Mm.
she, as a psychologist, was able to make diagnoses of all the particular situations these children were in. So where were these children going when in preschool they already have all these things stacked against them? And this is my point. They go straight into the hands of the gang leader and the narco trafficker, because we have not given them anything else to make another decision, or their parents, or to find a way out. So
Yeah.
yes, I agree with you. We have to have the borders. We have to have the whatever. We have to. But Trinidad already has one of the highest per capita police number of police.
It's not police that you need. It's what I
I
just
know, right? Yeah, but that's something that people call. Where are the police? Because we are in a situation where we are now dealing with the result of our inaction in other areas. That is my view.
Well, okay. I will just read out something that says here. People say hello everyone. Drug lords are hitched to the oligarchs. Oligarchs are cemented to the politicians. That's how people think. Whatever you may say, that's how they
No, but
feel.
it's true. No, I do disagree with that.
Right.
But in other words, okay, so the oligarchs are there, but I think what you do
And the
is
oligarchs are
strengthen people.
cemented to the politicians. That's the other part.
Yeah, but you strengthen and you educate the people so people could make the right decisions or
How are you
make the
going to do
right
that?
choices.
How are
And
you
that's
going
why
to
I'm
do
saying
that?
our education system is not preparing people to really address with the situation in which we find
Well,
ourselves.
do you think that's it doesn't ever occur to you that might be deliberate?
No, I also feel that some of our politicians also were educated in the same system. So many times, sometimes I mean,
I'll have to tell you.
they may also be victims of the same crisis that we're all in.
Anyway, we won't argue about that. I do think that you made a point, but I think you have to go to the root cause, and then when you go to the root cause, you will then be able to really attack a lot of the issues, especially education, as you said. And by the way, if there were opportunities open up, it's because for medicine and for law, what happened is now instead of having one faculty of law, we have three faculties of law. Instead of having one law school, we have three law schools. And when in medicine, St. George's University, that's where my daughter went. Were it not for that, and then they have the UE in Barbados to do medicine, and then you have Mona in Jamaica to do medicine. So there are far more graduates. In fact, there are a lot of graduates in medicine, which is a problem now. Your graduates
Exactly, and in law.
and law.
But that is what's wrong with our system.
And you didn't
The
prepare.
main aim of education for us is to get rich. Basically, that's what it is. It's not to fulfill the important needs of the society. And of course, the society doesn't reward that either. So that the kinds of people we really need, so everybody, whether they want to or not, end up fighting for those positions, making it so difficult. And what happened is the university responded to the demand. Right now, I think our social work program, if they're taking 30 students, I hope it's more than that. But then the law faculty, meanwhile, is taking in 230 something students.
You're joking.
Right? So where is our focus? Where is our focus?
Can I just ask a question here? Because we are talking about tertiary level education, and that is not the majority of our students. The majority of our students should be looking for other kinds of jobs. There was a time in this country when we had trade schools.
Yes, I said
that a lot of our students who did not do the A levels and the O levels very well, they were able to go to trade schools. They had other opportunities. And to me, our education system has diminished. It has just deteriorated to such an extent that the only thing we're trying to produce are people who will go to tertiary level education. And that is not the majority
What
of
about
us.
MIC? What about MIC? That's a
It's
trade
not
school.
enough, Karen.
But no, I'm telling you, what about OJTs?
Karen, OJTs are a waste of time.
No, I have to say that for people in the NGO movement, we have benefited a lot from OJTs.
Thank you.
I do agree that they do need that working experience. I used to have a different.
And I said that. I said
No, but
that.
you just said OJTs.
May I just finish, Karen? May I make a point?
Okay.
I said that point about OJTs because of the number of people I have met who said to me, I'm an OJT in the ministry of so and so, and I am filing, or I am an OJT and I'm doing nothing. So if the NGOs have benefited, that is fantastic, but that is still a small amount.
And the MIC. Let me look up how many training schools. What does COSTA do? Does COSTA?
Well, the thing is that
I'm asking. I genuinely don't know what COSTA does. You know,
but the
truth.
point,
a lot of them have had mission drift. Now, I agree with in fact, when I began, I did say that there was a whole system of trade schools. There was a whole system of continuing education. There was even the school leaving certificate, which allowed you to go. In other words, there was a whole alternative system. So even though everybody didn't go to high school, and what I found out too is that primary education in those days was so good that with a good primary education, you knew how to read, to write, you knew some history, some geography. In other words, a good primary education was very useful when combined with a trade. But now for many of our people who come out of primary school and they go to ask the tradespeople, they can't measure, they can't count, they don't have the discipline to sit still, to listen. So it's a really big complex.
It sounds like a big mess.
Yeah, but what I'm saying, Dennise, is that I totally agree with you. Not only that, there was alternative employment, but the whole manufacturing sector. You remember Elite Garments? You remember I used to work at the Industrial Development Corporation, my very first job. And that was a whole infrastructure to support and market tourism enterprise and local production. I used to be so proud. We used to have these fairs where you go and you see the local products, and then
JCs too.
Yeah, and then there was a buy local campaign because we had things to buy locally. But when you had the globalization and the free trade, where we had to open up our markets, then all of that crashed. Now we are trying to build it up again because there's nothing else in our economy. We thought we could get away with the oil and gas, but you can't put all your eggs in one basket.
No, that's why they put it in the drugs.
Yes, exactly. But not here alone, for the entire Caribbean.
I'm not interested in
I know, but you see, Karen, I'm sorry.
No,
I'm sorry, but I am a Caribbean person.
But I am a Caribbean person. But
I know. For example, during COVID, because of the situation where the bananas, the nutmegs, the everything had declined, the Caribbean only had two economic activities. That is drug production and tourism. And in COVID, all the tourism went down. And that's why we were in such a horrible situation. And so the region itself, we have to look at our economy and becoming independent, even though to build up to protect and support our own economy, because our levels of importation are much too high.
Professor Redock, a lot of people are supporting you on the issue with the education. Let me read out some of them. Okay? Mm-hmm. Maybe I wouldn't call the name. I don't know if they want me to call. I'll call it sincerely.
No, don't call the names.
No, don't call names.
Okay. So first one said, we had to know what we were saying to answer questions at all exams. And then again, the same person, all our problems started early in the 70s. Then someone says, a different person, saying, very interesting discourse, Professor Redock, pleasure listening to you. And then the same person said, very interesting discourse, but he repeated himself. Then the same person said, we could not have taken any entrance exam for secondary school, or even senior Cambridge University if we couldn't get 50% at class test. And he said, Professor Redock, how many years will it take to turn it around? Let me see if I missed anything before what he said is, he said he's really very engaged in this. He said we played football and cricket from elementary school. We never knew anything about multiple choice tests. At secondary school, we did English language, English literature, maths, geography, West Indian history. That's true, I did that. I did not do Latin, thank God. Spanish and French, biology. Later we did physics and chemistry. Let me see if I last thing. In the early days, we took the exhibition exam, and at elementary school, we did English. So the persons basically are saying that and this person said, different persons said, be training to pass an exam. So it feeds into all of your points about the education system has gone awry.
But then these are the same people who are working in the public service, who are our ministers, who are our journalists, who are everything. So I remember when I used to teach, people used to come and ask me if I could tell them what questions coming in the exam. And I used to say, would you like it if your doctor only studied foot and hand in the exam for his exam and didn't study anything else? And they would begin to think, because you see, the thing about Trinidad historically also, and I mean, we don't have time to go into other cultural aspects, but we are people. Trinidad is still a relatively new society. Many of us, in comparison with the other islands, and many of us came here to seek our fortune. And this situation of the late 1990s and so just made us worse. In other words, it made us more individualistic, more directed at whatever we could get, and therefore we also lost ethics, we lost values, we lost caring, we lost the way of speaking and communicating with each other. And therefore, because it's about me and myself, it's not about anybody else. And that is the ethos that is eaten away.
I agree with that.
Society.
I really agree with that, because I remember when I was, I think, and I said that thing, is a meme generation we living in now, who could have the best iPhone, who could have the best car, who could pose on the social platform, pretend their life is beautiful, while they don't have any food to eat, Whereas when I was in university, it was about communism, socialism, the oil and sugar coming together. People felt a sense of belonging to something greater than themselves.
Right. That's very important.
I think a part of the problem we are seeing is that the young generation really do not have something to believe in that is greater than themselves.
Exactly. And they want to. Many of them want to, but we are not providing it. Something bigger than themselves to believe in and to work towards. And I think that, and it goes throughout. That is the same thing in the guys in the gangs, and the same thing at the other levels. It's a general, not that feeling of no reason for why we are here and what we need to do. And I think that is also eaten away at the society at all levels.
I really, really think so, because I look at a lot of the this posting almost naked, or idolizing that type of behavior. I think it's a lost generation in a way, and the drugs.
Well, I don't think it's lost.
You don't think it's lost?
No, we can't think it's lost.
We can't. We don't have.
No, we have to have hope, and we have to really understand how to bring them to be part of the movement we need to make the change. Because if not, they'll just disappear. They'll
So what would you suggest then? What would you suggest?
Well, I feel that we need systems of public education, because, for example, the media has become so commercialized. I'm so sorry. I love you all. I love the media. I love radio in particular, and therefore, but in order to survive, they can't do what a media is supposed to do in terms of educating the public. So, for example, I would like, something I've wanted a long time, is a radio call-in show on Trinidad and Tobago history, because I think that's another of our problems. We don't know our history. We feel we know it, but we don't. And we have all kind of myths and beliefs and theories that are so incorrect or at best incomplete. And they shape how we think about others, they shape how we think about ourselves, and I think that if you don't know who you are and where you come from, you're already starting in a lost position. So I would really like to see some sort of radio program because we have people who have researched the history. I know there are lots of people, but we never hear them, we never learn from them. So in other words, I think that the public education component, I think public education is very important. And I think whenever people are provided with education, they feel enlightened. They want to know more because it gives them an understanding of things around them that they didn't have an explanation for. So I really think that public education is the thing where you start, and you start it in communities, on radio, on television, or wherever. That I think is really important because in the schools, we're not getting that. Let me not be not all schools, right? But many schools, because they want the children to pass to become lawyers and doctors and whatever. That all of that is left out. You know. So
In the 70s, media, the role of media was to educate, to inform, and to entertain.
yes.
That was a value system around media. But
Mhm.
then when the country bought over like TTT and some of the radio stations, the politicians transformed that into communicating about what they have done. And we continue to see it, that the politicians, some of them are, there's ownership of some media houses by the government, so there's state enterprise ownership. And once there is that, then there is an attempt by the politicians to determine what we will be promoting, what we will be saying. So I think we've moved away from educate, inform, and entertain. And we have to transition that into a new approach, but certainly an approach that is focused on how do we educate our people using both social media and traditional media.
Yes, yes, yes.
There's one question I wanted to ask you. You talked about corporal punishment in schools, and I wondered if you could comment on that. Has that worked? What is the impact of that? If you
Well, the thing is that you know, we are the descendants of enslaved and indentured peoples, and our ancestors were very harshly treated. And even though we know they fought against it, we still believe deep down that the best way to get somebody to do the right thing is to treat them badly. And I think also that's why we believe that prison and all that kind of thing is, those are the solutions. But so I totally disagree with corporal punishment. I think that our parents did what they knew best. And but what I have always argued for is that one of the things I think we should also be teaching in secondary schools, in the life skills program or in the health and family life program, is parenting, because most people are going to become parents and there's no preparation for it. It's a hit and miss, and also parenting in the 21st century with digital medias, with social medias, with whatever. How are parents prepared for this new world? And I also did a study with the ILO on reconciling work with family. And I wrote about this. And I think people don't really understand the point I'm making because this is also part of the social. In other words, how do you support parents? In this society, we just blame parents. I've heard people say, what? Arrest the parent when the child commits a crime. But nobody has helped that parent to learn a little how to deal with children, the stages of child development, alternative ways of discipline. You know, the parent just has to figure that out, or if they're middle class, they buy a Dr. Spock book or something and they read it up. That if we say parenting is the most important job,
That is
why
true.
is nobody preparing you for it?
That is true.
Dr. Dr. Redock, I want to just go back a little further, and this is a controversial statement that I'm going to make, that we need to be teaching sex education in school because of the high rate of teenage pregnancy that we are having, and the high rate of pregnancy with women who have not decided that I am ready to have a child. They've got involved in sex, they've not used any contraceptive, they've got pregnant, and so they have a child and they're not ready for that. They
Denise, can I ask you something when you ask that question? Is it, when you talk about sex education, is it the birds and the bees only, or is it the whole idea of sex education and you're dealing with transgender, all of these other things? Because that is the world that the children are living in. I hear it from younger children, and I'm so surprised with the conversation that they give you, which you're hearing from their friends or watching on things. So when you say sex education, what is your
I have no limitations on sex education. None.
okay?
Young
fact,
women.
Sorry,
Go
sorry.
ahead. Go ahead, Dr. Redock.
No, you're absolutely right. And you said young women and men. Really, it's like a life skill. That we don't prepare children for, but in a way we live with our heads in the sand, because it's all around us. And I mean, children need to get it in an age appropriate manner from people who are experts, from people who have been trained to deal with these questions. In the Scandinavian countries, they are strong advocates for this because they found that it has been so useful and so helpful in their societies. But there are also very powerful groups that are against this. And,
Yes.
our politics is very much based on, negotiating among powerful groups. So that I think that is why, for me, educating the public is important, so that the sensitive public becomes the most powerful group. The sensitized and educated and informed public becomes the most powerful group. So I really think that young people are being cheated out of the knowledge and the information that they need to make the right decisions and to live the kinds of lives that they deserve. I
You
think
know,
that's really very backward.
Dr. Redock, one of the things, I guess I'm saying this because drawing from my own, when I say not my personal experience, but being exposed to that sort of thing, I think one of the things that the schools should do, especially with the SEA students who have done the SEA, so they're there for another term, preparing them for, I suppose, for secondary school. One of the things I think they really should do, is deal with the issue of puberty. Because I think that a lot of young boys and girls, when they start experiencing, with the changes, the hormonal changes, all the changes, some of that, they sometimes hide it. They are embarrassed by it. They think they own. I think that's important for, at least if they're not going to do this sex education or include that in sex education, they should be a part of that last term where they teach them about the changes in puberty, not only the change in your voice, or you're going to have to use deodorant, but you know what I mean, and all the other things. I think they need to tell these children about it to prepare them for, because getting to be a young person, getting to be a preteen. I saw a movie with my grandchildren yesterday, and it was very good for that because it told you all the changes that go on with these children, the anxiety, the apparent rudeness. They will have to start preparing them. I think that is a big weakness in not preparing the children for the change that is going to happen when they reach that 11, 12 thing. And that's something the schools have an opportunity to do in at least the last term before they enter into high school.
Well, I'm so happy you raised that because there was something I wanted to raise today. I've been active in research and campaigning on child sexual abuse. And recently, we're trying to write it up now for publishing. And I was reminded of a study done by Daphne Phillips. Remember, she's a sociologist. In 2009, she did it in a number of a few secondary schools, and I remember her telling me about it, and I never followed up on it. And now I went back and found it. And what was so interesting, we often forget how violent schools are.
Mm-hmm.
And so, I mean, in schools, children are not only bullied, we have reports of in boys' school, boys being raped,
Mm-hmm.
of girls being harassed and sexual raped and gang raped in school. I mean, school is very violent. Schools are very violent. In fact, one of the reasons some boys drop out of school is because of the violence in the school. So this is why I'm saying we really so many deeper things that we need to look at. So this sexual violence was interesting because she said the children were so angry. The girl spoke about, she said they listed a long list of male relatives who they say sexually abused them, from fathers, stepfathers, uncles, brothers, cousins. And of course, there's also, although to a lesser extent, abuse of young boys. But she said when you spoke to the students, their anger, and then they were saying they wanted to kill, they feel to kill, they feel to bounce them down in the road, they hate them. I mean, the levels of anger coming from these children, I think that also fuels some of the violence of everyday life that we're experiencing. And I mean, a lot of the violence is gang violence, but there's also people who get vexed and go for a cutlass and come and, or somebody who feels disrespected and come and shoot somebody. So there's a lot of psychosocial trauma and difficulty in our society. And we used to have a child guidance clinic where parents could take their children who were having problems. That gone. If you have a psychological problem or you feel that, you know, I don't know where the public, I could be wrong. I don't know what the public services are, but I know in private services, you'll be lucky if you get somebody charging $300 an hour. But what I'm saying is not only that, we don't have a public awareness of mental health issues so that parents could know and understand. We don't have a public awareness of addiction issues so parents could know what to do when the child start to smoke weed or start to use cocaine. Parents are just left out there in the wild. They don't know. And then when the child died, of course, they say it was a nice child because they tried their best with the child, but the other powers overtook them. So what I want to say is that the anger, something like sexual violence, you would never think of contributing to the crime situation, but that anger and rage that many young people are experiencing, and they speak about how they took out their rage by bullying other children, beating up other children, stealing their lunch money. You know, the criminality is already in the
Yeah,
school.
but that's why it's because they hurt people.
Exactly. And we have a lot of hurt people.
And
And
that's
there's
what makes them so vulnerable and so
exactly,
easy to be recruited into a life of violence.
exactly. That is it. And
And
in our case, they're recruited into like gangs. Some of
Yeah,
them are also in some countries to extremist religious organizations,
yeah.
some to very right wing political groups, extremist groups. So that is what is created as a scholar called Guy Standing. He speaks of a new group called the precariat, people living in precarious circumstances. And
That's
he
right.
said they're an army that is available to the siren call of any extremist group, extremist religious group, whatever. And this is what we are facing. But somehow this is not articulated. We don't understand it. We're fighting as best we should. And really, we need a more informed way
I,
of dealing with
well,
it.
my everything you said, I agree with. I guess my perspective is that for example, you talked a lot about the social programs that have been implemented, but the truth of the matter is many of those social programs or grants and so on are not living wages. You can't even buy groceries with it. Okay, so that keeps you down there.
Mhm.
That keeps you down there. Instead of doing all these programs you're talking about, you think they haven't thought about it? They can't think two, three of us are the most brilliant people to think about they should do those things. It's obvious they know what they can do, but it suits them to keep them in a state where they are remain vulnerable and available for what is exactly, unless we understand that and we acknowledge it and we see that you're going to be fighting a fight that you're not going to win. For example, Professor Redock. I mean, even if I got a job, let's say with CPAP, I'll not say CPAP involved in it, but let's just say a CPAP job. And you know, a lot of times with those CPAP jobs, they don't get, some of them, they don't get a whole month of bouquets, a few days of whatever it is. Whatever it is, it's $2,000 or $3,000. Somebody come to them and tell them to take some coke, let's take this package up the road, and they pay them $5,000. Why would they not do it? Of course they're going to do it. So you have got to stop that $5,000 before you could deal with the $3,000. And that's my point. And everything you said is valuable. Everything you said has weight. But as I said, and I will continue to say, and I think people recognize it, that unless we understand that our problem is the transshipment, and we do not deal with that, we are spinning top in mud. As you even said in your presentation, you had said early on, we keep on using the same prescriptions, and because the real prescriptions is to lock off our borders and stop the trade. And if you stop the trade, you have a fighting chance of doing all the things you're talking about. That's my perspective.
My perspective is shifted a little, and that is that while the narco state is important, the other side of it that is critical is to ensure that your citizens understand that we all contribute to making this society thrive. So we have to do what we have to take responsibility as well. We can't just say it's a narco state. No, we have to take responsibility. We also have to take responsibility for our education. So when Dr. Barrett, when you talked about earlier on that if you see your child starting to smoke marijuana or starting to take cocaine and so on, just as you could Google and see what fashion to wear, you could Google and figure out how can I help my child. But to me, one of the big issues is that there are no consequences in our society for doing the wrong thing. Oftentimes you do the wrong thing and you get away with it. You do the wrong thing and you say, don't worry, nothing is going to happen.
And does not worry you then? Does not worry you?
Of course it worries me.
Well, I agree with you. I agree with you and that is something that upsets me no end. The kind of lack of social accountability. And I think that it has really got much worse. And I mean, I could keep you here hours because it's something I speak about a lot. So I hear you, but I do not think that people are not. Let me tell you, when those mothers lose, sometimes on the papers you hear one mother has lost 3 children shot to death. Those are consequences. When so many people are facing consequences every day, all those young boys who are being shot. And do you know, I saw a statistic once that homicide is the largest cause of death in the 14 to 19 age group among males in Trinidad and Tobago. Homicide.
Yes.
So those are consequences.
That's glamorization.
We are all facing those consequences because just the trauma of living in this society, we are all being affected. So we are facing consequences. But I agree with you that what I call the slackness of the way in which things operate in many, or the VAPsness, Lloyd Best would say by VAPs, because all of a sudden by VAPs, you start to arrest people and then next week you stop, or by VAPs, it's a kind of slackness and VAPsness that affects us. It was always there, but it has reached a very low level at this point in time. But
you know what you see? Dr. Redock, I don't know if you've seen I don't see many of them, but I've seen a few of them, where you see these young men with their guns, I don't know all the different kind of guns, but all the kind of fancy guns. And they glamorize the lifestyle. And the girls glamorize it too, because they want to be with a bad boy. And he pay for the weave, and he pay for the nails, and he paid for this. And so they actually, in my respectful opinion, some of them have resigned themselves to dying at 25 because they don't see any big thing. That's part of the lifestyle. And, they've been, when you look at it, they seem not to have an understanding of the consequences, even to the children that they leave behind, which is another generation of thing. So we really have to find a way to stop the leakage. I
Well,
think.
one thing I noticed with those pictures of the young men, and I want you to look at it next time, they all look
Yeah.
undernourished to me. They all
But they're not eating, they're doing their drugs.
Well, this is it. They're sick. That is the whole thing. They're all sick. And if a society has such a significant proportion of its youth that's sick, we can't just say they want it so. Recently my women's group, Cafe TNT, we had an
Yes.
excellent webinar on security something, and there was a study of women in these gangs who are attached to these gangs.
Yeah.
First of all, the women can't leave the community. They can't, that's like the men, which we
Yeah.
forget, they can't leave the community to go to work. And I
Mhm.
think that we really need to find out what's going on, and sometimes they do end up doing something because then there's nothing else for them to do. There's no family planning. The family planning, when I was growing up, even in my young adulthood, there was such a thing as a population council, which monitored population, which gave out the health education in schools, spoke about conduct. That doesn't exist. I mean, if you're in a drug zone and you can't leave, where you getting condoms? Farm off where you getting anything else? So that or birth control pills. So I think that we really need to understand the reality of the conditions under which people are living. And
the
what
causes
happens,
of those
it's like a cycle.
It
That,
is.
and how do you break that cycle?
I just told you already.
I think I think women have a big role to play, so that we have to take responsibility, because for every male criminal, he has a mother. He's likely to have a woman. He is likely to have a sister. How is it that these three women were not in a position or did not recognize that that criminal was beginning to transform? And how is it that she was not able to say to him, come on, can you try something else? Can we do something differently? So I'm asking the question, really, why have women lost their voices?
Okay. Well, there are some instances where the women still try, but in those really that in a city kind of drug gang related areas, the women, they too have lost whatever. And that study was very interesting because they said the women, they can't go out to work, the guys don't go out to work. So basically, that is why we have all the robbery. It's a predatory robbery because they don't earn. So when you're hungry, you have to go and get something. And therefore, I think that a few years ago, the situation was not so bad. And when I did a study with mothers in the communities, and the mothers who had lost sons, who had lost husbands, who had lost, because these women are facing huge losses, and they'll tell you how they tried, what they did. Those were in days when they could have still moved about, when things were better. But in many of those communities, things are so bad. But my question is, what are we doing to support these mothers and sisters and whoever who want to do? In other words, because of the very individualistic way we see the society, we say that's your problem, you have to take care of your children. But as I tell everybody, Trinidad and Tobago has a decline in child rate.
Yeah.
And the majority of children are not from the middle class, they're from the working class. So those are our children. And if we don't take responsibility for them, well, we see where we're heading already. So I don't think we need to say where the mothers or the fathers. If the mothers and the fathers could have done better, they would have. It's clearly that they can't. So we have to see what we need to do so that they can do what is necessary.
I hear that. But that analysis that I just suggested there, I have also looked at it in terms of corruption, because most of the people who are involved in corruption are men.
Yes.
How is it that their mother their woman, their sister, the women in their lives? How is it that they didn't say to them, that is not in the interest of the society?
Because they
Is it
benefit from it.
beneficial? Is it because they're getting the money? And again, is it because they don't see that there are any consequences for this? They see that they will get away with it.
Well, in some cases they do get away with it, as I said. So that's very true. And it is true that sometimes they benefit from it. But I think the thing that we haven't mentioned here is patriarchal power, that women still exist in situations of unequal power. And yes, they could try to influence, the old thing, trying to speak to them while they lie down in bed in the night or whatever, cook or go, how you try to influence. But, but, men basically are still strong. They have loud voices and they can shout louder than you. So sometimes it's not always so easy. You can try. I think you try with your children, but I think mothers need help to try with their children. They can't do it alone.
Wonderful.
I before you whine upon it, I think that was a good discussion, a little narrow as far as from maybe because of the politician in me. And yes, because I see that as I see the validity in all that you said, but I do not think that anything can be done because at the end of the day, everything goes back to gangs and drugs and unlicensed guns, and therefore goes back to the trade. So unless you're willing to deal with that, you are not going to get it, as we have seen for the last 30, 40 years.
And isn't that the role of the politician? Wasn't that your role?
But that is exactly what I would. That is exactly what I was doing. That is why when I was the Minister of Finance, I got the Trinidad and Tobago Revenue Authority passed in the lower house by with a 3/5 majority. That is why when I was Minister of Finance, I set up the FIU and was putting a person who was a non-Trinidadian who the Americans had recommended to me. That is why when I was Minister of Finance, the gambling legislation had a sunset clause that it was going to be closed down, as Mr. Manning had said, and there would be no more gambling in Trinidad.
Yes, yeah.
Because of so you ask me what I did as a minister. Those are three measures that was and by the way, the TTRA was targeted at the drug trade, which I was very familiar with as being Minister of Finance. So when I speak on those issues, I'm not speaking without knowledge. And I did a lot. I could not stop calling the elections. That was his call. But if he had not called it, those things would have been implemented fully.
Well, you see, Karen, that is the whole question of male power as well.
Exactly. But I don't know if a woman would have done it. All I know is that I had a lot of power. I was given a lot of power. I was given a lot of power with the International Financial Center. I was given a lot of power to set up the TTRA. I was given a lot of power with the property tax, which they have not changed. I was given a lot of power with the Gambling Commission. Mr. Manning did not instruct me in any of those things. He gave me, I did the Financial Intelligence Act was passed. I set up the FIU. So I did my part. And so when I talk about the drug trade, I am not talking without knowledge. I'm talking with a lot of knowledge that is what we were doing. And if Mr. Manning had not called elections, a lot of those things would have seen the light of day, and we may not have to have this conversation in the detail level that we are having it today.
Yeah,
Thank you very much, Karen. Thank you very much, Karen and Rhoda. We just have about 3 more minutes. So I would like you to just spend some time telling us what would you like the man in the maxi taxi or the woman in the maxi taxi to take away from this conversation.
Okay. I think that we really need to lobby for change in our social life. I think that we need a greater, in other words, what we have been doing in terms of crime, the police, the arms, the weapons, the prison, we need a substantial change in that because that is reproducing the problem. And we need to really get to the communities that are the fodder for organized crime. In addition to what Karen suggested, we really need to work in the communities and to support mothers, fathers, parents, teachers, transform education, to really strengthen the society to deal with what is coming from outside.
So thank you very much, Professor Rhoda Redock. It has been absolutely wonderful chatting with you. And Karen, what are your final comments for today?
My final comment is when I've never seen as many comments, because usually I don't. Well, let me just say this: you got so many compliments, Professor Redock. So many compliments from the listeners, and we clearly have reached. I don't know if they're in the maxi taxi or not. I do not know where they are, but wherever they are, they have followed what you have said. They have appreciated what you've said. In fact, if I could just say, hallelujah, Professor. Hallelujah, Professor. So my parting comments are that you have reached the demand, not only in the maxi taxi, but in whatever vehicle he is in, and made a difference in the education and understanding of the weaknesses in our educational system. And hopefully we can do better as we move forward.
Thank you very much. Thank you. And to all of our viewers and listeners, join us again next Monday when we will continue with these conversations. The intention of these conversations is to ensure that we all develop in such a way that we improve our society. Trinidad is a beautiful place, and I want to see Trinidad and Tobago thrive and do very well. Thank you very much. Have a great week.
Yeah. Thank you.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you,
Bye.
Professor Redock, Dennise, and Karen. That's it for today's edition of Hard Talk by Power 102 Digital Monday. Karen and Dennise will